That's great. Thank you. So I'll keep that in mind as we move forward, because I'm not going to be diving inside the 6 core processes of ACT today and teaching it as it's normally presented in an introductory workshop. I'm literally going to be just touching upon it briefly, but I will be referencing it throughout the webinar, and I'll make sure that I can tailor my languaging for people of different learning levels or experience levels. Okay, so going epic in ACT, getting experiential, pragmatic, integrative, and contextual in acceptance and commitment therapy. That's what we're working towards today. John already gave my introduction. Thank you very much. I also have a small private practice, and I provide individual coaching and consultation on ACT and other contextual behavioral approaches as well. And then my main gig is at an integrative medicine program at Sutter Health. These are our 3 main learning objectives for today. So one is to be able to describe how contextual behavioral principles inform ACT in therapy. All right, so, and then to discriminate between consistent and inconsistent interventions with respect to an epic approach. Later on, my hope and plan is to do a demonstration where you'll have the opportunity to watch for and code whether my interventions are consistent or inconsistent with respect to being experiential, pragmatic, integrative, and contextual. And then to demonstrate through multiple exemplars how to leverage core processes, the 6 core processes of ACT, and relational frames in interventions that influence our clients' behavior and ultimately can transform their lives. Okay, these are our primary 2 targets of acceptance and commitment therapy, otherwise known as ACT for short. So we have psychological flexibility, which is what we are working towards or trying to shape in our clients' behavior. This is simply being open, aware, and engaged. Open with respect to being able to step back, notice, and be willing to have our thoughts and feelings as they are in the moment. So stepping into each moment with our whole selves, consciously, fully, and based upon the context at hand, based upon whether I'm at work or in a relationship or doing something for leisure, based upon my given history, based upon my goals, doing what I can to make choices guided by my values. And ideally workable choices that are informed by values and adaptive in moving our lives in a direction that matters, or workable with respect to the given context. Psychological inflexibility, conversely, is a process in which our behavior is rigidly guided by psychological reactions. In other words, by fusion and experiential avoidance, at least primarily. And what I mean by that is, in fusion, we are buying into our thoughts, taking them literally, and oftentimes engaging in rule-governed behavior, where there's a rule that we take with us that is not necessarily sensitive to the contingencies in our, especially the meaningful contingencies in our context, but rather a rule of what I should be doing given X, Y, or Z. And I follow that rule, even if it's not workable with respect to my valued goals. And or there are difficult thoughts and feelings that I am actively trying to avoid, to escape from, or I am struggling with and trying to resist. And in doing so, it naturally pulls us away from living the lives that we ultimately want to live, because our values and our vulnerabilities, in the words of Kelly Wilson, are poured from the same vessel. So when we turn away from our vulnerabilities, when we turn away from difficult thoughts and feelings, when we're suppressing them or avoiding situations, avoiding actions, choices where those difficult feelings might come up, it likely also means that our values guided goals are being blocked. We're not moving in that direction. So what we're looking for in therapy are these relatively narrow, inflexible patterns of behavior that are insensitive to context. So in other words, when you have a client where most of their choices or behaviors are being influenced by what they don't want to experience, right? You will likely see how their behavioral repertoires will narrow, as will their lives, right? So we live in a smaller space in that way, at least symbolically, and sometimes literally. Like imagine a client who with a severe panic disorder with agoraphobia and won't leave the home, right? And their lives can get smaller. And that is primarily fueled by fusion with worries and fears and experiential avoidance. But this will also show up in sessions with our clients, in the way they hold themselves, in their posture, in their eye contact, in how they respond to questions they ask, whether they skip over important or hard topics, or are they able to lean into them and slow down and express vulnerable feelings when we touch upon those hard topics. So these are the things we're looking for in session as well. Now, in my longer 8-week-long course, we dive very fully into everything I just said within a couple different modules. So we are interested in psychological flexibility, and the kind of the core unit of analysis is the act in context, which we'll come back to in a moment. But for now, I'm going to invite you to look at what I've come to call the flex capacitor. For those of you who have seen the movie trilogy Back to the Future, you might recall Doc Brown and his discovery of the flux capacitor when he, I think, hit his head on the bathroom sink, perhaps, and then this image came to mind that ended up being the fuel source, or the catalyst for the whatever the name of that vehicle was. I can't remember, in the Back to the Future trilogy. So anyway, when I look at this, it kind of resembles that to me a bit. So I loosely call this now the flex capacitor. Now, it didn't happen with me bumping my head or anything, but several years ago, this image came to mind, and I was thinking about, there's psychological flexibility, which is the heart of the ACT model. However, how are we shaping that in sessions, in therapy with clients? And so, so firstly, in the center here, we have what I was just talking about, and we can look at psychological flexibility. At least we can look at it on multiple levels, but for our purposes today and with therapeutic encounters, at least on these two levels, the intrapersonal level and the interpersonal level. So on the intrapersonal level, we are interested and paying attention to how are we as clinicians relating and responding to our inner world, our own private events. Are we open and aware as this is coming up for us? How is the client responding to their own private events? And then interpersonally, and also coming back to the intrapersonal lens, that also means even making conscious contact with our values as well, being aware of the desired qualities of being and doing that we want to engage in our lives. And then on the interpersonal level, we're looking at, um, of course, how the client is engaging in their life and in their relationships, but also what's happening in the relationship right here in therapy, what's happening between us. And this, of course, includes a lot of our languaging, but it also includes our sheer presence. Like for me, as a white, cisgendered, American, heterosexual, relatively privileged male, I know that my presence is likely to have an influence and perhaps unknown influences on my client sitting in front of me, and especially if there's someone who has suffered from marginalization or oppression due to race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender. So my presence alone, right? So am I aware that in this context, the context of the therapeutic relationship, that what I'm bringing to the table inherently or historically at least is going to have some bearing on the client's behavior. So interpersonally, we're taking all of that into consideration. And then we have these three outer circles, which really inform how we do the work in therapy. So we have analysis, or more specifically, functional analysis in the lower right circle, where we're interested in antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. So the antecedents being anything that precedes behaviors. This can include private events, thoughts and feelings that show up right before the client does X, Y, or Z. It can include how they're holding or relating to those private events. It can include the situational context of both therapy, the client's lives, relevant historical factors, all of that. We're interested in how that might be influencing or giving rise to the client's behaviors. And then consequences. Consequences are what is reinforcing this behavior. And especially if it's problematic behavior, it's often under negative reinforcement, meaning the clients are getting some relief. They're getting away from something they don't want to experience, which typically reinforces the behavior and makes it more likely that they're going to keep doing it. And then in ACT, we are not always, but often working with positive reinforcement, trying to enhance motivation to engage in more values-based actions. And we're also looking at the consequences of our interventions. How are they landing with the client in front of us as well? And then that brings us to our interventions, right? So with interventions, we're interested in shaping behavior. So modeling, evoking, and reinforcing. And for those of you familiar with FAP, or functional analytic psychotherapy, which is like a cousin to ACT, you're probably familiar with especially evoking and reinforcing, which is a big part of the 5 rules of FAP. And then there's also modeling. Modeling, what are we doing as a therapist? Including in our self-disclosures, our facial expressions, our behavior? Are we modeling psychological flexibility or inflexibility on our part? And then we have our approach, and this is our focus for today: experiential, pragmatic, integrative, and contextual. And one of the ways, another way of looking at this is to imagine we're building a house of flexibility, where the design of the house is like our approach, the plan we're taking to make the house, to build a house. The materials we're working with are the A's, B's, and C's: antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. And the tools are our interventions: modeling, evoking, and reinforcing. And this all rests upon a foundation of function. We are especially interested in how behavior is functioning in a given context with respect to a person's goals. So here's an example of ACT in context, which is the root metaphor of functional contextualism, which is the philosophy that underlies ACT. So you see me jumping here with my hands up, my mouth open. And right now, all we have, excuse me, is the topographical form of my behavior. In other words, we can see what I'm doing, but we don't know why I'm doing it or what's influencing what I'm doing, right? So we need context to better understand the function, the purpose, and the effects of what I'm doing. So imagine there's a grizzly bear, right? Now we have some context we just added, and here I am jumping with my mouth open like this. And so perhaps my jumping in this context is a involuntary elicited response, a fear-based response to the grizzly bear. Now, I have not luckily encountered a grizzly bear in my life, but my understanding is jumping like this is probably not a good idea. I understand ideally we might want to play dead and hope that he passes over us or she passes over us. But nevertheless, right, there's the function of my behavior. Or we can change the context, right? Changing the context here, same behavior, but very different function. Here, it's functioning perhaps to engage in a spontaneous activity with my family or to have some fun as we're getting our pictures taken, right? So very different function. Okay, so we are interested in, this is like the core unit of analysis as we are targeting psychological flexibility with an epic approach, right? So this is our focus for the rest of our session today. First, I'm going to unpack this a bit here with some definitions and some clinical examples. And then we're going to unpack each of these through metaphors and experiential exercises. Okay. So firstly, so the E is for experiential. And by the way, very important, this much of this webinar, but especially the EPIC approach and that acronym comes out of the book. Well, at least it was derived from the book, not directly, but derived from the book Mastering the Clinical Conversation, Language's Intervention by Matthew Villatte, Jennifer Villatte, and Stephen Hayes. One of my favorite clinical textbooks. It's essentially a clinical application of relational frame theory, but really is incredibly congruent with acceptance and commitment therapy too. Okay, so we are helping clients to orient towards and derive learning from their direct experiences in life. In other words, we're helping them to observe what they're experiencing, including their behaviors and the context at hand, helping them to describe those experiences with some detail, at least enough detail that they can make more informed, conscious, and ideally values-based choices, and tracking their behaviors. Is this particular behavior effective with regards to my goals? Okay, so orienting towards and deriving learning from direct experiences. Another way of putting that is observing, describing, and tracking behavioral contingencies. Now, what does this look like clinically? Well, we might simply ask, what did you notice after doing X, Y, or Z? What did you notice after you took your kids to the park or played that game with them? What did you notice after you had that drink? What did you notice after you worked out? What did you notice after you, said that made that remark to your spouse? So tracking those contingencies and kind of getting in touch with a consequence there. Now, this would be opposed to us being a little bit more directive or didactic. And you'll see that on a future slide. What I mean by directive or didactic, I mean directive in that we're being more suggestive, sort of like, instead of what would you notice after doing this, we might say, so maybe you should do this, or I would recommend that you do this. Or kind of imposing, like, it would probably be helpful if you do this. Or didactic in that we're kind of teaching something, providing more education. Like studies show that it would be helpful if you do this, that kind of thing. Now, it doesn't mean that we would never be directive or didactic. Of course, there's going to be situations where that might be called for and could be very functional. But we are housing that in an overall experiential approach. And we will come back to that too. Okay, so, there's something else I was going to mention. We can get even more experiential by bringing attention to the here and now processes in therapy. What are you noticing right now as you share that with me? Or, I notice how you pulled away, right, when I said that. Did you notice that too? Right? So once again, there's helping the client to contact the contingencies of their behaviors out in the world, but more importantly, bringing attention to the in-session behaviors, those contingencies as well, because we can directly work with the context right there and then. We'll come back to that with many examples later. The P is for pragmatic, focusing on what is useful or helpful, or in ACT terms, workable with respect to goals. And in ACT, we're looking at values-based goals. In other words, the desired qualities of being and doing that our clients want to put into their lives. What kind of what kind of parent or spouse or friend do they want to be? Do they want to be kind or respectful or patient or loving? What qualities do they want to put into their work? Do they want to be someone who contributes, who's diligent, who's patient, right? So looking at these qualities, coming up with goals, and focusing on what is useful or helpful with respect to those goals. This is in contrast with basing our experiences and our understanding of our experiences on what is subjectively true with a capital T. In other words, the client might have a thought such as like, I'm too restless to meditate, or meditating is not for me. And just to mention, I don't push meditation on every client either, but let's just say client comes in and they're talking about meditation, or somehow you work up to that possibly being an intervention they can use that can be helpful with respect to their goals, and client says, I'm too restless to meditate, or it's not for me. Now, that statement that they said may very well correspond with some subjective experience they've had, or perhaps a rule that, to meditate, you need to be present 100% of the time. And I've heard that many times from clients in the past, as I imagine some of you have. Or to meditate, you got your mind's got to be clear of all thoughts. So they undoubtedly have had experiences, if they've tried meditating, where their experience corresponded with that rule. But that doesn't mean that it's necessarily useful or helpful with respect to their goals. It doesn't tell us whether meditating could actually be meaningful or useful to them. And so if the client were to say, I meditated last week and I noticed that I was more centered in my interactions with others afterwards, or I was able to focus so much better on my work afterwards, or I fell asleep more easily and more peacefully afterwards, then they're in touch with the consequences, the contingencies with respect to their goals, whatever those might be. So that would be a more pragmatic way of making sense of their experiences. And this is also in contrast with what is socially expected or socially approved for them to do. In other words, client says, yeah, I meditated because you asked me to, and I didn't want to disappoint you, right? Have you ever had a client come back, for a session, and they've done some life assignment, as I call it, and you recognize somewhere in their languaging and their facial expressions that for them it was more about, not letting you down, right? Not disappointing you. And so they're making sense of their experiences, or their behavior is being more influenced by what we call social coherence. Social coherence is a form of rule-governed behavior that is mediated by social reinforcement. Put more simply, it's when our behavior is motivated by social approval, disapproval, what's socially expected, not expected, social norms, etc. Now, there could be times when someone's behavior is both socially coherent and pragmatic, or in other words, functionally coherent. So let's say someone is masking up when they go into a school, even though they don't want to wear the mask, but they're wearing it because it's socially expected for them to do. That might also be pragmatic with respect to, preventing spread of COVID, let's say, but it might not be pragmatic with respect to their individual goals. And this is where we get at goals at an individual level versus like at a community level, which is not our focus for today, but just wanted to put that out there. Okay, I is integrative. So in an integrative approach, and this is very much informed by relational frame theory in particular, we're approaching language in a constructive and coherent manner, and not just any coherence, and coherence meaning how we make sense of things, but coherence that is pragmatic, that is functional in nature. So notice how the I and the P go together here. And some of you may have already noticed that even the E and the P go together, right? Because we're tracking behavioral contingencies sort of in both of those principles. So with integrative, we are building and expanding upon relational networks. You'll see what I mean by that shortly, but this comes out of relational frame theory, and we are constantly relating stimuli with each other and then building networks. So rather than trying to tear down a network, we're building and enhancing or constructing new networks with our clients. Essentially, this is a yes and approach, And in doing so, we can foster more wholeness, more inclusivity, more self-acceptance. And we'll come back to that too. This is as opposed to attempting to debate, replace, get rid of our thoughts and feelings, which often doesn't work and tends to actually intensify them. So just to give you a quick taste of that right now, if I ask you all to not think about your first name, so whatever your first name is, for the next 10 seconds, your objective is to not think about your first name. Ready? Go. All right, time's up. How did you guys do with that? How did you do with not thinking about your first name? Not so good. Many of you are familiar with ACT, have done lots of exercises like that before. But what you may or may not know is that the reason why it is so difficult to not think about something, and in this case, your first name, is because of relational framing. And so notice how I didn't actually say your first name. So unlike, let's say, the pink elephant or white bear exercise, I didn't say your actual first name. I just said the words first name. But those words are in a tightly bound frame of coordination with your actual first name. They're coordinated together, tightly bound. When I say tightly bound, that is a non-technical term that is being studied across the globe in terms of how do we actually measure that strength of those relational frames. But for our purposes today, we can say tightly bound. And because it's tightly bound, we are not going to break that bond here so easily. Once it's there, right? So in fact, the harder we try not to think that, it's like we're trying to hit a subtraction button that has been unknowingly replaced with a multiplication sign. So we're amplifying it by trying not to think about it, right? And so I see one person said they thought of a different name. Okay, good for you. I tried distraction, but I knew what I was trying to avoid. Not so great. Amanda says it kept popping into my mind. Impossible not to think about it. Yep, exactly. Right. So given all that, we are taking a integrative approach, a yes and approach. And so what might this look like is, client presents a thought, right? And we might say, so there's this thought, or there's this part of you, and how do you respond to that thought? Or what can you do in the presence of that thought? Or what effect does it have on you? Right? So this sort of yes and approach, we're building it out, looking at consequences, contingencies, antecedents, what situation are you in when those thoughts tend to arise? And as you'll see shortly, and then we can get really creative with how we use relational framing and core processes to alter the context to really transform the function of those thoughts. But even as simple as, so there's this thought, notice how our words, we're prefacing the actual thought with words, so there's this thought. And there's this thought implies, can provide a little bit of distance between the client and the thought. Okay, so thus transforming the function or the effect that the thought might have on them. And we'll like I said, we'll see more of that shortly. Okay. And then contextual. So our approach is contextual. It's contextual sort of in two distinct yet related ways. One is we're shaping behavior by altering the context to transform function, as I was just sort of exemplifying. And we're very interested in A's, B's, and C's, antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. In this case, antecedents and consequences, which are the context for behavior. And that's what we're targeting much of the time in our interventions. And we're primarily working with the symbolic context, as we'll see shortly. So as an example here, client says, I feel at a loss with parenting. We might say, so what does that look like when you're with your children, when you're at a loss with parenting? So we're helping them getting in contact with their behavior, actual behavior in context, rather than a descriptive label, I feel at a loss. We're helping them to, once again, make contact with their behavior in context. Or what do your children notice, or what effect does that have on them when you're at a loss? Or if you are the parent you most want to be, getting in touch with values, what would that look like? Right. And so we also might alter context through our facial expressions, our bodily gestures, or perhaps even through brief, well-timed, functional self-disclosures. All of this, which can help to normalize the client's behavior, and thus transforming perhaps some of the shame they might experience in being at a loss as a parent. Okay. So now we're going to unpack each of these with a metaphor and an experiential exercise. I'm tempted here to pause for questions. Let me do that. Let me pause for questions really quick. And I said I'm tempted because I'm wondering if I'm going to answer some of those questions as I go forward. So if you ask a question that I know I'm going to answer, I'll let you know that up front. Otherwise, if you have any questions right now, feel free to do so. And you can chat or you can unmute. All right, I'm going to move us forward then. Okay, here we go. So being experiential is like getting into the dirt with our clients and helping them learn how to grow their own gardens, as opposed to offering them a fruit or vegetable when they're hungry, which would be being more didactic or directive. So in other words, if we can help them to know how to plant seeds, water them, make sure they have the right amount of sun and shade, they can grow all the fruits and vegetables they want and have them whenever they need throughout the duration of their lives. In other words, as we help them to make contact with their behaviors and the contingencies that give rise to and maintain their behaviors, we can evoke self-agency. That is their ability to have some control and choice over their actions, which can be empowering in the long run, as opposed to us simply giving a directive like, you should try this, or, or didactic like, studies show that exercise is good for depression, right? So now there might be times, once again, where we offer a directive or a didactic if the client's asking for it, as long as we're not sensing that there's a kind of a functional dependence or experiential avoidance happening by them constantly asking for information or education. Or once again, if clients like actively suicidal or immobilized due to trauma or psychosis, those might be times when we might want to be a little bit more didactic or especially directive, depending upon what's at stake here. But ideally, we're helping them to grow their own gardens. And so along those lines, we're going to do a little exercise here. So we're going to get experiential. And my first question to you is, what range of overt meaning observable out here, what range of overt behaviors could you do in the current context? Right here, right now, for wherever you're sitting, what range of overt behaviors could you do in the current context? And what I'm going to invite you to do is to and let me answer this question really quick. Chastity says, so is being didactic the same as providing psychoeducation? I would say yes. I would say yes. And there's, of course, a time and a place for that. Yes. So I'm going to ask you to chat, or yeah, let's just start with a chat. To chat, what range of behaviors, what is something you can do sitting where you're at right now, and try to think outside the box, right? So out of your normal repertoire, what are some things you can do right here, right now, and that are observable by others? And please put them in the chat. All right, so Sarah says, singing, dancing, sitting still, doing push-ups. Hey, Kevin. Hello, Kevin. Drinking water, painting my nails, raising a hand, turning on video, putting feet up on the desk, running, dancing, sleep, running, standing on my head. I'd like to see that. Standing up, neck stretches. Oh, that feels good. Making a paper airplane. My son would like that. Patting or petting my cat. I let my cat out right before our session started because I knew I'd have to. Taking my shoes off. Yeah, my shoes are off right now. Typing on the keyboard, stretching, tapping pencil on the desk, etc. Eating Cheetos. All right, Cheetos. Okay, great. Now, what I'm going to ask you is what is the most flexible, unrestrained behavior that you're willing to do right now on camera, keeping in mind this is being recorded. Although my understanding is the gallery view is not being recorded, but it's being recorded and I have the gallery view, and I'm going to encourage others to change your view to gallery view for this exercise here. Okay. So once again, what is the most flexible, unrestrained behavior that you're willing to engage in right here, right now on camera? So think about that for a moment. And it could simply be smiling. But what I'm asking you to do is to go beyond your comfort zone and perhaps stay within your window of tolerance. So beyond your comfort zone, but within your window of tolerance, what are you willing to do? So you have a couple seconds to decide. Okay. So on the count of three, oh, great question. Lillian said, in the service of, yes, good question. That is a great question, right? Because that would be more pragmatic, because right now we're just experiential. In the service of whatever goal you might have for today's session, or in the context of your life as a whole. That's a great question. I'll leave that up to you guys to answer for yourselves, right? I'm expressing an invitation. I'll leave it up to you how you proceed. I'm going to do something. I'm probably going to take my headset off here. I'm going to count to three. Hopefully I won't be the only one doing this, but I'm willing to do that. And yeah, we'll see where we go. And if there are others on the screen, once again on gallery view, just check out what other people are doing too. So I'm going to count to three, and we're going to engage in the behavior for 10 seconds. That's it. 10 seconds of engaging in a behavior. You guys ready? All right, 1, whoops, 2, 3. Awesome. Awesome. Very cool. And we have a cat dancing, flying in the air. Awesome. I love it. Oh, push-ups too. Was that push-ups, Peter, or I missed it? Peter did something. I missed it. Extra points. What was it?
It was the stand on my head. You said you wanted to see it.
Oh, I missed. I caught the tail end of it. Thank you, though, for doing that. Thank you for participating. Yes, being put on camera is a big deal. Extra points for the cat, Valeria says. Now, I have 2 questions for you. Firstly, right now, what consequences are you noticing? What effects are you noticing having engaged in that behavior? And feel free to chat or unmute yourself. And consequences to you, within you, or out here in the group as a whole as well. Dizzy after spinning, smiling, joy, I feel a bit silly, happier, more connected to the group, embarrassment, LOL, back feels better after stretching, elevated heart rate, yes, my heart rate is elevated too, endorphin rush, relax, my breath is sped up a little bit because I was dancing, feeling connected, we're in a 2-week lockdown, more awake, more comfortable with the group, connected and happy. Awesome, awesome. And embarrassed, sure. And what antecedents did you notice before you engage in the behavior? Other than my prompting to do the behavior, what did you notice showing up inside of you just before you engaged in the behavior? Noticing my mind criticizing. Oh, in my last pose, okay. It was an anticipation, initially tight chest, uncertainty, anxiousness, uneasiness, racing heartbeat, hesitation, nervous. Yeah, I got nervous just beforehand too. Questioning a connection to the purpose, self-consciousness, indecision over what to choose, impressed with everyone's willingness, vulnerable. Yeah, speaking of vulnerable, we're gonna venture there in just a little bit more. All right, anxious. Thank you so much for participating and being with me here and engaging in that little exercise. So I'm going to move us forward here. Okay. Pragmatic. So notice the donut holes on the fingers of this young woman. Now, what is pragmatic about this? Well, it depends on her goal. If her goal is to eat these donuts without a plate, well, this might be a very pragmatic move on her part. If her goal is to have fun while she's eating the donuts, once again, this might be a very pragmatic move. Or even to, to eat them while doing something else, so or eat them while standing up, right? So if those are her goals, then these could be very functional, pragmatic behaviors on her part. That is opposed to if she or we, let's say, had a rule in our head like, you shouldn't eat like that, in public, right? People might, people might talk about you badly. You might feel embarrassed for having done so, right? And then we would say her behavior was much more influenced by social coherence, more concern with rules around social expectations, norms, etc., or gaining social reinforcement or approval of some kind. And this is also as opposed to correspondence. In other words, let's say we have a thought like, my hands would be so sticky eating this way. Yes, that might be true, right? However, does that matter with respect to our goals? In a pragmatic approach, we would say no. From a more kind of a subjective truth, correspondent based approach, that might be there might be more emphasis on that, whether our hands would be sticky from doing this. Okay, so the idea here is to evoke self-efficacy, which is our ability to not just make choices as in self-agency, but to make choices that are effective with regards to our goals, that are workable with respect to living a values-based life. Okay. So we're going to, another little exercise here. We're going to get pragmatic. Given your existing resources, so given the rest of the time that you have for yourself today. So you guys are all over the globe. And so you might only have minutes after this webinar is over. Some of you might have hours after this webinar is over. Given the time, energy, your situation, given your existing resources, what is one meaningful action that you would like to engage in before the end of the day today? And I don't mean like something you would simply check off, like a task you would simply check off, but rather your head is hitting the pillow at night. And as it does, you can say to yourself, doing that enriched my life a little bit, or doing that filled my heart a little bit. So what is one meaningful action you'd like to engage in before the end of the day today? And feel free to chat that as people are starting to do. Have a tough conversation, go on a date night with my wife, watch the new Ted Lasso, calling my grandmother, going to get a massage, awesome, plan on finish reading the book, watch my favorite sport, call parents, reading for pleasure, jogging, spending meaningful time with my kids. Awesome. Open and loving conversation with my wife during happy hour, bake a cake, drop off a gift. And perhaps some of you are getting ideas from other people here too, if you're struggling to come up with something. Okay. Now, what is the first and or smallest step you can take in that direction? Once again, what is the first or smallest step you can take in that direction? Now, for some of you, the first step might be one and the same as the actual meaningful action. There might not be a step you need to take beforehand. And for others, there might be steps. Like someone said, go out on a date with my wife, right? Is there already plans for that? Have you already asked her? other certain arrangements you need to make as to where you're going, making dinner. Do you have the food you need already? Taking a shower? Do you have your clothes set aside or a towel, right? So what is the first or smallest step you can take in that direction? And what I'm inviting you to do now is either in the chat or you can unmute yourself, either way, and to simply share what the meaningful action is and the small step. And like I said, many of you are doing it in the chat. Like Kevin has said, invite my wife to happy hour, because the action he wants to have is having a loving, engaged conversation with her during happy hour, right? Schedule a time on my planner. Now, warning, publicly declaring your intention to engage in a meaningful action might make it more likely that you'll actually do it. So be warned that unless you want to have a more meaningful and enriching life, you might not want to declare this publicly. So only declare publicly if you would like to have a more meaningful and fulfilling life. Okay, do my hair, put on my shoes, grab coat and mask for vigorous walk between showers, connect with friends at my house for dinner, go to grocery store for the ingredients, determining to call grandmother as soon as seminar ends, step outside after baby's bath. I don't need much prompting to get my massage, LOL. I'll be hopping in my car soon for the appointment. All right. Decide on which cake to bake. Draw a bath so I can have, I think I'm gonna have a bath this evening as well, Valeria. I'm gonna take your meaningful action. That sounds good to me. Put some Epsom salt, some lavender in there. Okay, awesome. Awesome. So and some of you very familiar with ACT will know that what we're talking about here is values and committed action, or values-based action here. And this is really very much where the pragmatism kind of shines on the hexaflex, although it can be applied to the entire hexaflex. Okay, the I is for integrative. So you'll notice this bowl of soup. And so being integrative is like a bowl of soup, because let's imagine for a moment that, for some reason I lost you guys. Oh, well. So it's like a bowl of soup. So let's say the client comes to you asking for you to help them eliminate their distressing memories or painful feelings, which is a common ask, request, or common goal in at least in my experience. So they come to you asking to remove that or eliminate those painful experiences. To me, that's like trying to remove the salt from this bowl of soup. I don't know how to do that without dumping the entire bowl of soup. And that would be like dumping the entire contents or of our client's life experiences. We probably don't want to do that. They don't want to do that, right? So the salt is part of the whole. However, what we can do is add ingredients to the soup. We can add more water or more broth. We can add more veggies or more spices. In other words, we can add ingredients which will transform the taste of the soup while still making room for the salt, making more space for the salt. Now you'll notice the little greenery sitting on the top of the soup here. Let's say that is like a headache that someone has, an allergy headache, or in my case, I have a headache from smoke in Northern California here today. And and perhaps taking an allergy medication or some Advil helps to eliminate the headache. That would be like removing the greenery from the soup. Sometimes we can do that. And, there's probably no pragmatic reason why we wouldn't do that. But when it comes to our thoughts and feelings, especially emotions, very difficult, if not impossible, to do that. And a lot of this is related to, once again, relational frame theory, which as we exemplified earlier, that these, especially when we have these tightly bound relational frames, very difficult to remove anything in those networks. So in this integrative approach, we're adding ingredients, transforming the taste as opposed to trying to eliminate anything. This naturally evokes self-inclusion, self-acceptance, more wholeness in our clients.
Lou, are you aware that you're not sharing the screen?
Oh, shoot. No. So thank you. Yeah, I don't know what happened there. But that makes sense. Yes, you can see rolling, but not the slides. Yeah, that's so interesting. Let's try that again. I'm guessing you can see this now, right? Okay. It was just a lovely bowl of soup here. So, all right, thank you. All right, integrative. So now we're going to get integrative. So here's the first question. What vulnerability are you willing to share in this context? For example, I struggle with blank, or I tend to hide this part of me, or I tend to hide from others this. So I struggle with, or I hide. You don't have to frame it in that way. These are just suggestions. And what I'm wondering and hoping for is that we as a group, can we as a group evoke acceptance and inclusion simply through sharing? And I'm going to be the first to share. So I'll share something and I'm going to open it up for others to share. But can we evoke acceptance and inclusion through sharing and through simply bearing witness? So instead of trying to jump in and problem solve anything or reassure anybody, can we still foster acceptance and inclusion with sharing and bearing witness? And of course, once again, keep in mind this is being recorded, and only share what you're willing to share. And as we go through this process, notice any transformations in the taste of the soup as a whole, okay? So I'll start, and then once again, afterwards, anyone who would like to share what you struggle with, one thing you struggle with or something you hide from others, and ideally, if you're willing to unmute yourself and share it out loud, I would highly welcome that. If you prefer not to, then you can put it in the chat box, and that's fine too. So you gauge that for yourself, okay? So, and this is something I have not actually shared before, I don't think, in a workshop or training event. And it's coming up for me right now because my children just went back to school in person for the first time in a year and a half. They went back on Wednesday, and today's their third day. And already, my son was sent home because he's got a stomach ache, and they want him to get tested. Stomach ache, I don't think has anything to do with COVID, but that's their protocol, and I respect that. But nevertheless, I struggle with worries and fears related to health and mortality for myself and for my loved ones, especially my family. And this is something I've been struggling with for a long time. And the pandemic has, that context has definitely not been helpful with regards to goals I might have around that. So anything you're willing to share, and if you're willing to unmute yourself, I would highly welcome that. Just as a statement, a short statement, that's it. And I see someone saying, I struggle with paying attention. I hide my declining health from others. I let unpleasant tasks slide. Take your time. I think I'm weird. I struggle with feeling not skilled enough in context of work. And I'm purposefully not sharing names for the audio recording. Worries about my children's emotional well-being, not being skilled enough, hiding the extent of my alcohol use. still recovering emotionally from cancer, with a thought that I don't know what I'm doing, hide my chronic illness, not being good enough, being assertive or feeling confident to be so, imposter syndrome, unhooking from past decisions I regret, withhold expressing my deepest wishes, staying calm when my kids are out of control and not listening. That's hard for me too. Self-judgments that I'm not perfect or high achieving. Had a debilitating bout with anxiety a few years ago. So just in bearing witness, can we be accepting and inclusive of each other with our individual and collective struggles as they are, without needing to, in the moment, fix anything? Thank you for sharing. Worry about my children's emotional well-being too. Thank you for sharing. And notice how, as each person steps forward to share some vulnerable part of themselves, notice like what you're coming into contact with in this group as a whole. You notice how there's this context of common humanity and suffering. I struggle with not knowing what the heck I'm doing. So I'm just kind of breathing in and out, as I might do if I was with a client, listening, bearing witness to, breathing, noticing how even that is an alteration of the context that can transform the effects that some of these struggles might be having on them. All right, I'm going to move us forward here. And this time I'm going to go to this one and see if this makes a difference. Yeah, okay. All right. Notice the strawberry. And if this strawberry was right in front of you right now, notice if you would be drawn towards it or would want to move away from it. I might push it away. Just notice, in other words, if it has more appetitive functions for you, if it's more desirable, or if it has more aversive functions for you, if it's not so desirable. Right? So just notice that. And notice how we're going to alter the context and see if the functions of the strawberry change for you. So now we put the strawberry in a smoothie with other fruit, perhaps some coconut milk or other milk. And notice how you may relate this smoothie to some relational network, such as your morning routine or living a healthier life or family, right? Or a blender, right? So it might be related to some network that has other stimuli in that network, and notice how that can transform the functions that the strawberry might have on you. Now it might be more appetitive, more appealing, or perhaps less. We can add some chocolate to the strawberries, right? Dip them in chocolate and notice how this image might be part of a relational network that includes romance or relationships or holidays, and how that can transform the functions or the effects on you. Now we have a PG-13 image, right? And notice how this image, the strawberry in this context, can also transform some of its functions, where for some of you, it might have very appetitive functions that I won't ask you to disclose right now during the webinar, although could be very fitting to disclose in another context, right? So just notice that. And then finally, we might add some mold to the strawberry and how that can transform the functions again to something much more aversive, where less desirable, even disgusted by it, right? Now, in therapy, we're often not working with strawberries. We're working with language primarily, where we usually are not able to physically alter the environmental context of our clients, usually, sometimes perhaps, depending upon your line of work. But we're most often working with the symbolic world, languaging. And so we're gonna do a lot of exemplars on that shortly. But before we do, I like to do a demonstration here. Yes, a demonstration. Now I'm going to put the coding form again for this, for those of you who arrived later. There is a coding form that I put in the chat box earlier. It's also on the Praxis page for the webinar too. I just added it again to the chat box so you can open it up from there. And I'm briefly going to show it on my screen here too, so you can see what I'm getting at. So this is a coding form for EPIC. And shortly, my hope, my plan is to do a brief demonstration with a volunteer. That's my hope, that someone would be willing to volunteer with me for 10 minutes. It might even be shorter than 10 minutes, maybe like 8 minutes, where you can either role play a client, like a composite of a client, being careful not to disclose any identifiable information, or you can real play yourself. Perhaps even whatever you shared in the integrative exercise that you struggle with, if you're willing to, we could do a little real play around that. I'm going to leave that up to you, given that, once again, this is being recorded, and John will probably ask for your permission, you know, if we when we post this, to make sure you're okay with it afterwards. So ultimately, you'll have some say on that. But this coding form, what I'm asking you to do is to document anything I say or do, any interventions that seem to be significant to you in some way, and to determine, is this intervention consistent or inconsistent with respect to any applicable parts of an EPIC approach, so E, P, I, and C. Now, some interventions will touch upon a few of these principles. Some you might not be able to pick up on any. Some might have both a consistent and an inconsistent quality to them. And remember, so what I'm going to be discriminating between is, for the E, is being experiential versus being a little bit more didactic or directive. For the P, pragmatic versus focusing more on what the truth is, and also what's socially perhaps expected of them. The I would be integrative, like adding, building, versus trying to subtract or eliminate. And the C is for working with context, altering the context, focusing on contingencies, antecedents, and consequences, versus, and I forgot to mention this earlier with the strawberry, taking a more formistic or mechanistic approach. And what I mean by that, formistic is, we're more interested in categories like DSM diagnoses or personality traits or structures, and whether or not a person's behaviors or symptoms meet criteria for a particular category. So with a formistic approach, we're much more interested in categorizing what's happening. In a mechanistic approach, we're more interested in viewing the mind as a machine made up of parts. And our job is to kind of remove or replace the broken parts, the broken thoughts, the irrational thoughts, right? So that'd be more of a mechanistic approach, okay, as opposed to contextual. So a lot of you would just be doing kind of some guesswork on this. You're not being graded on this. It's just an exercise to see if you can distinguish for each of these, and then we'll debrief afterwards. So what did you notice? What interventions did you document? And what did you notice as particularly consistent or inconsistent with any of the principles? Yeah, and she mentioned, right, I need a tool from you, and I kind of rolled with it. And what if it's okay? And yes, and right, yes, and what if it's a different tool that you might need, right? Sure, that would be an integrative example. Thank you. Catherine says, I notice a lot of experiential and pragmatic coupled together. Yes, yeah, the two often go together. Valeria says, when you noticed, what do you do afterwards, consistent with the contextual part, targeting consequence or actually in this case the behavior in response to the antecedent, right? When she wakes up in panic, what does she do afterwards? That was both experiential, right? She was helping her to make contact with the contingencies of her behavior, and specifically her behavior in this case. Okay, what else? Yeah, it's kind of experiential on my part, right? And integrative. And then I was asking her, what do you make of that? Yeah, I wasn't sure exactly where I was going with that or how that was going to land. But what I was trying to exemplify was that, this is possible to have the anxiety and still be present without being directive. Like I was trying to demonstrate it through experience. Yes, thank you. Carl says, maybe we need to target the panic disorder itself. Was that an attempt to demonstrate inconsistent with integrative language by focusing on a label? Yes, and it was especially inconsistent with the contextual part, because instead of being contextual, I was in this case being more formistic. I was focusing more on the category, the diagnosis. That's what we need to target. And I lost sight of the context, the antecedents, behaviors, and consequences. It's absent from panic disorder. Yes, that was intentionally inconsistent. When you asked about what she wanted to do here now, that was pragmatic. Yes, exactly. Yeah, what would you like to do here now? Very, very pragmatic. Or what would you like to work towards together here? Pragmatic. Anyone else? And if you're unsure, now's a great time to ask, like, oh, I'm not sure about this one. I struggled finding other inconsistencies, Catherine says. Yeah, there were a few intentional ones, and I think you guys are already picking up on them. Oh, there was one other one. Earlier on, I was really focused on her getting relief from the anxiety. Now, we can look at that one of two ways. Like, it ended up evoking a context for creative hopelessness, looking at the unworkability in her behaviors. But my intention at the time was like, let's see if we can get you some relief, from this anxiety. But I didn't want to be too obvious with that. But there was one time when she says, oh yeah, I got a little relief. And I said, good. So you get a little relief, when you do that. So I was emphasizing that a little bit. In other words, reinforcing that a little bit, which is not what we want to do in ACT or with an epic approach. But she didn't pick up on it in that way. She was looking at it as what I'm doing is not working. So we can be inconsistent and still do ACT well if we have a really, really, cooperative and ACT-informed client, right? Because she knew that. Okay, I'm going to move us forward here. I hope you found that useful. I'm realizing that that I have a lot more here that I won't get. So I'm going to move through this very quickly. These are all going to be examples of how, and you guys are going to have access to the slides too, of how we can transform function by altering context. Okay, so first, here's a clinical example. Let's imagine that this is Colin, and Colin has, as an adult, young adult, Colin has come in to see you. Colin's struggling, let's say, with depression, low self-esteem, although we might use other languaging and ACT. And he comes in, and as he's sharing a little bit about his historical context, he shares that he was told early on in his life that his ball playing or his music performance or his academic performance or his hair or his body, something about him was not good enough. Okay. So he got this messaging from the socio-verbal community that some aspect of him was not good enough. All right. Now, through derived responding, so from that messaging, he may have derived that I'm not good enough. And the process and act for this is self as content, where he's viewing himself as the content of his experiences. And another way of putting this is through in relational framing, he is coordinating himself with not good enough. I'm not good enough. And notice how this is all arbitrarily applicable. And what I mean by that is, you know, none of this is necessarily based upon any physical or formal characteristics, like his ball playing or his academic performance or the way he says hello or is not good enough. You know, it's based upon what we as a socio-verbal community assign value or meaning to these events. So it's arbitrary in that way. All right, so he starts thinking I'm not good enough and internalizes that, becomes fused with that self as content, and that can transform his sense of self, right? Transforms his sense of self, how he holds and views himself, the story, the narrative that he takes with him into different contexts in his life. Now, we already know that if we try to jump in and remove that relational network, that is not going to be very effective. What we do instead, can we build, enhance upon this network? So let's say he's in therapy and we use a deictic framing intervention. I'll come back to that in a moment, what we mean by deictic framing. And we ask, Colin, let's say that your loved one, your spouse, your friend, your mother comes to you and says, I'm not good enough. What would show up in you, or how would you respond? How would you want to respond to your loved one as they share that with you? And let's say Colin says, I'd offer a hug and I'd say, I'm here for you, or that sounds hard, or I'm sorry that you're experiencing that. And now with some clients, they might start to derive all on their own without anything else from us, that what we're kind of aiming for here is self-compassion. In other words, when that narrative shows up for Colin, he can turn towards himself and offer himself a hug and say, I'm here for you and I'm sorry, and that's hard. Right? Or it might take a few more interventions for us to get there. Like, could you apply what you would apply for your mom or your child to yourself, right? And notice how that further transforms his sense of self. Now, when I'm not good enough comes up, that's a cue to practice self-compassion. Right? So he has got a more compassionate view of himself. Okay. And all of what we're doing here is playing with the context, altering context. Deictic framing or deictic framing is one type of relational frame. I'm not going to go into all of these right now because we don't have time, but suffice to say there are 8, 9 different types of relational frames here. Okay. And we can use these as tools, as interventions. But to further that example, taking that I'm not good enough narrative, I'm going to show 9 examples here of how we might intervene by altering the context with relational frames. And for those of you who are familiar with the relational frames, I'll invite you to chat the type of frame you're noticing in the intervention. Here we go. So you have this part of you So let's say that's our first thing we say. So you have this part of you. What relational frame are we using here? Yes, hierarchical, right? And what we're the process of act we're targeting is self as context. Or we might say, when is the first time you can recall having this thought? So what type of frame is this? Anybody? Temporal, yes. And what we're aiming for here is looking at the historical context, recognizing that they weren't born with this thought. Somewhere along the way, they acquired it, through relational framing. Where did this emanate from, right? Same aim as the when is the first time you can recall, possibly. Where did this emanate from? Recognizing this came from outside of them. It was at some point, it was never inside of them. It came from out here, right? And so this is a spatial frame. And notice how both of these can also help to normalize the client's experience, given this historical context. Bruce says, if you pair the not good enough story with self-compassion, won't the initiation of self-compassion trigger the story due to relational framing? Yes, it can. Yes, it can. However, part of our aim is to increase flexible responding in the presence of aversive stimuli. And if the client's able to do that, their repertoire expands a little bit. And that's one of the main aims of ACT, but it can. What effect does this thought have on you? What effect does this thought have on you? I'm going to move through this quickly for time's sake, but this is conditional framing, which is kind of a cause effect. If then, or what impact might this have? This type of framing is commonly used as part of a pragmatic approach. How is this different from I'm broken or I'm unlovable? Helping the client to discriminate between different narratives, and it might give us a better sense of what we want to target. Oops, let me move this over. And if you were good enough, this would be opposite or opposition framing, right? So we're going in the opposite direction. And if you were good enough, what might you be doing? What would that look like, right? Is this a familiar narrative? Is this a familiar narrative? So we're using coordination framing. We're coordinating I'm not good enough with narrative, and that can facilitate a little bit of diffusion as well. Is this more or less impactful than the I'm unlovable story? Once again, just discriminating there. And then finally, what would the you now say to that younger you who first experienced this thought, this belief, right? Another kind of path to self-compassion. Okay, so we can also transform these aversive stimuli through the core processes. And I'm going to go move through these very quickly. So client says, I'm afraid of dying. We might ask, can you stay in contact with this fear for a moment, right? A present moment oriented intervention. Or what does this fear reveal that's important to you, right? So values and vulnerabilities. What are the values on the other side of this fear? When would you be willing to make room for this fear, right? So willingness, acceptance in a certain context or with respect to a certain goal. Are you able to notice this as a thought, right? So little self as context, little diffusion here, more diffusion. What can you still do in your life while having this fear? So committed action, right? So I can have this thought and still do things. And finally, is there more to you than this fear? Is there more to you than this fear? Well, yes, there's these other parts of me too. So all of these, altering the context, we're using the core processes, and the aim here is, can we transform some of these aversive functions of I'm afraid of dying so that it has less hold or power over the client? And are they able to behave more flexibly in response or in the presence of this stimulus? Now, we can also do the same. I'll do one more example here. In this case, we can transform the function of something that's appetitive to the client. In this case, let's say drinking alcohol, very appetitive, let's say, and we can use the same processes. Are you able to stay fully present with your spouse or at work while you're drinking, as an example? And is this aligned with who you most want to be? Right, so values-oriented question and workability. Are there, well, all of these are sort of aimed at workability. Are there feelings you suppress while you're drinking that later resurface? Right, so once again, experiential avoidance, the other side of acceptance. Do you think about it when you're not drinking? So do you think about drinking even when you're not drinking? All right, so is there fusion happening? What happens if this pattern persists over time? What happens if this pattern persists over time? So when we talk about patterns, we're looking at committed action, the other side of committed action. And finally, how would the future you look back on this? How would the future you look back on this, right? On these behaviors. Okay, so I'm gonna skip through this one. You have that slide and it's your turn. Client says, I feel so lonely. I feel so lonely. What is the very first thing you might say in response to that? That could, once again, you're part of the context, you could use a relational frame, you could use a core process, or something outside of ACT as well, you know, where you're helping the client to relate differently to this thought. So think about that. Client says, I feel so lonely. What might you say? So you can unmute yourself or you can put it in the chat. I feel so lonely. I feel really lonely right now. Gut response. What might you say? What does this loneliness tell you about what matters to you? Yes, awesome. What does this loneliness tell you about what matters to you? That's a values-oriented question, right? Because it's that loneliness is pointing to something on the other side that really matters to them. And that was Paul. Rachel says, how old is this feeling of loneliness? Sure. So we're getting in touch with the historical context here, how long they've been holding this. Chantal says, during which situations do you notice that feeling coming up for you? Right. So we're looking at context, situational context. Does this feeling have a shape, a color, helping the client to describe the contingencies of this behavior here? How does it get in the way? And by asking if it has a shape and a color, we're also asking them to be present with it, to make contact with it, right? So to approach it. How does it get in the way of your life, right? So what effect does it have? So rather than viewing I feel lonely as the problem, we're looking at the effect, the consequence that it has, because we can alter that. Can you describe how you feel this in your body, right here, right now, present moment, process oriented? How close or how far away are you from this feeling of loneliness? So maybe facilitating some diffusion here. What do you notice yourself doing when this feeling shows up? Right. So we can look at that question either, how do you behave in the how do you behave in the presence of this feeling? Or where are you when this feeling shows up, right? So we can look at it either way. We're looking at the antecedent and the behavior. Are there moments where you don't feel that way? Are there moments when you don't feel that way, right? So distinguishing, discriminating, recognizing that it's not perhaps as persistent as they might think. And that and it changes, right? What sensations show up with this feeling? Awesome. When you feel lonely, what do you do? Right? What would you tell someone? What would you tell someone else if they felt lonely? Yeah, once again, perspective taking, right? Which can foster more flexible responding. Do you ever feel this way in the room here with me? Experiential, here and now, present moment, therapeutic relationship context. How much space does loneliness take up? Right. Is there more to you than that? Or, how much space does it take up? Is this and it could be self as context. Is this a feeling that you can have? Is this a feeling that you can have? Willingness, acceptance. How familiar is this feeling? Awesome, awesome, awesome examples. Love them. We are out of time. I'm going to quickly mention that if you're interested in participating in the full course, it starts in 2 weeks, Feedback Enhance ACT, Shaping Psychological Flexibility on the Fly. It's 8 weeks long, exactly at this time on Fridays, and it's very practice oriented. So first 45 minutes, we do check-in regarding skills we're learning, a little didactic, such as today, but a much shorter didactic, and then a lot of practice. Practice with video vignettes, practice in demos, and practice, a lot of practice in small groups, which takes place every session. So love to have you join me if you're interested. Each session, each module in the long course has a different coding form. We're targeting different things, the core processes and EPIC, and then we get into the ACT fidelity measure. So it's all about sharpening our clinical skills with respect to the openness, awareness, engagement, and the therapeutic relationship. So we dive into that in the second half of the series, sharpening, targeting skills for improvement, and giving supportive, constructive feedback to each other in the process. All right, that's a wrap for me. Thank you all for being here. Lovely to see you and to be with you, and hope to see you again soon.